Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Good morning, Sonali.
A staggering number of people are going hungry, quote unquote. Those are the words of Joyce Luma, the director of the World Food Program. She was talking to the New York Times about a crisis in the world's newest nation, South Sudan. Just 4 years ago, the Republic of South Sudan offered hope for peace when it split off from Sudan. But 2 years ago, fighting broke out between various groups, and there was a rise in unspeakable crimes, many aimed at women and children. Now more than 4 million people are at risk of starvation in the landlocked African nation. The World Food Program has struggled to send food to South Sudan, but aid workers have also been targeted by fighters. South Sudan has rich oil fields that are at the heart of a power struggle between various factions in the government. And to make matters worse, there's now a cholera outbreak reported in the capital, Juba, with 18 people dead and 170 confirmed to be infected. Bob, there's been very little coverage of this crisis in the media. Why?
Well, I think it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. If there's no direct effect on the United States, often we don't hear a lot of coverage. Of course, there is always an effect in the sense that we're moral agents. We're concerned about the fate of others around the world. Here, I think one of the things we should be focused on is the role of the United Nations. If there is a solution to this crisis, the United Nations and regional groupings around the world are going to be central to it. The United States has so thoroughly undermined the effectiveness and legitimacy of the United Nations for so long. I think it always comes back to our role. Even if we don't see where we can intervene in this crisis today beyond providing humanitarian aid, we can always come back and ask, how are we going to be more supportive of the potential of the United Nations in resolving these kinds of crises?
The group ActionAid has just released a new report about violence against women's rights activists internationally. Surveying nearly 50 activists from a number of countries, including Afghanistan, Nigeria, South Africa, Brazil, and the US, the report concluded that women are suffering more violence than before and that governments are not doing enough to protect them. Worse, often governments are themselves perpetrators of physical and verbal abuses. Most vulnerable are those working on abortion and LGBT rights. ActionAid has launched a campaign in the UK, where they are based, called Fearless, which calls for more funding and better enforcement of human rights standards. According to the Guardian newspaper, quote, the mobilization of women's rights organizations was the most important factor in turning commitments to end violence into meaningful action, having more impact than the number of women in parliament or the wealth of a country. Bob, one of the main reasons for this rise in violence, according to the report, is simply a lack of funding. Is the story one ultimately about capitalism and wealth inequality?
No, I don't think it's just that. You know, the underlying problem, of course, is patriarchy, a system we don't name often enough. Institutionalized male dominance. Now, that's a reality of the lives of women around the world. Patriarchy takes different forms in different places. If you go to Afghanistan, it looks different than it does in the United States, of course. But I think that the problem is, in that sense, worldwide. And until we start talking about patriarchy and the problem of institutionalized male violence, I don't think we're going to make much progress. Now, funding is often a problem. In the United States, for instance, rape crisis centers made advances over the last 40 years, but are sort of systematically being underfunded now. Again, in other countries, the problem is more dramatic. But, until we can talk honestly about patriarchy and then, of course, a feminist response to it, I don't think we're going to make that much progress either here or abroad.
And finally, Republicans are scrambling to reverse their position on the Confederate flag, which most people see as a symbol of the U.S.'s racist past, but which conservatives often refer to as the rebel flag. In the wake of the Charleston terror attack, there has been a huge public outcry over the flags being flown outside the South Carolina State House and in a number of other southern states. Now, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley has reversed her position on the flag, saying yesterday in a press conference that she supported taking down the, quote, deeply offensive symbol of a brutally offensive past. The New York Times speculated that, quote, the flag would inevitably complicate Haley's selection as a cabinet member or even vice presidential nominee if she wanted either. Meanwhile, the state of Mississippi is also considering changing its flag, which actually encompasses the Confederate flag in its design. Bob, do these stories represent a symbolic victory for racial justice?
Symbolic, although it seems rather thin. I mean, the fact that in 2015 we're still talking about the Confederate battle flag is a little sad. It would be as if Germany was still talking about whether the swastika was an appropriate symbol to honor the sacrifice of German veterans in World War II. In that case, you can't imagine it. It would be, morally unthinkable. But it's an analogous situation. Nazi comparisons are often overdrawn, but in this case, it's dead on. And the fact that it took this mass murder to even put the issue on the agenda of Republican politicians in South Carolina and around the country is really, really quite sad. And of course, this is not limited to South Carolina. On my own campus, the University of Texas at Austin, we still have statues to Jefferson Davis and other Confederates that the university seems to be
about the Charleston terror attack. I want to thank you so much, Bob, as always, for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Anali.